Welcome to the Trauma Informed Lens podcast. Each week, Matt, Curt, Jerry, and the occasional special guest explore how the trauma-informed paradigm challenges traditional beliefs and approaches concerning a wide variety of areas. This podcast addresses psychological trauma in an educational manner and is not designed to replace mental health treatment. If anything in this podcast makes you feel uncomfortable or anxious, please talk to a mental health professional.
Welcome, friends, to episode 80 of the Trauma Informed Lens podcast. Today, we're going to continue our conversation from episode 79 about creating a trauma-informed organization, or at least how to think about the journey to integrate trauma-informed principles into your organization. And, you know, I kind of like, we didn't plan this out, but it's kind of fun that this one hit episode 80. So we now have over probably around 85 hours would be my guess, if not closer to 90 hours of podcasting behind us. So this is kind of a fun one to hit a 80 episode, because really talking about implementing a lot of the ideas that we've talked about throughout this podcast. So Jerry, Curt, congratulations on hitting 80. I guess we're 2 weeks plus with some overtime if anybody wants to just make their new employees listen to us, which God hope nobody would do that to anybody. But hey, it's a bit of fun 80 episodes. So as always, we start out with our bright, shiny objects of the week. And Jerry, let's start with you. What's your bright, shiny object of the week this week?
You know, I have to say I was watching the Masters yesterday and seeing Tiger win.
He won?
Yes, he won the Masters yesterday. And, you know, just the emotional ups and downs of sports, you know, going from being on top to the depth of physical kind of limitations and all the things he went through, and then to kind of come back yesterday and win the Masters. You know, there's lots of things that you really kind of morally and ethically struggle with sports. But when you see those kinds of experiences, certainly you can. I was excited to watch the event. So that's my bright, shiny object of the week.
Very cool. Curt, what about you?
Well, that was pretty great. I mean, it was some ups and downs for sure. I didn't get to watch the whole thing, but I watched portions of it, and then I got to see after I was gone while the whole thing was happening. But the final picture of how happy he looked, like that excitement on his face, that was pretty cool. That was really cool. I think along the lines of creating a trauma-informed organization and kind of going down that pathway, I'm working with an organization here in town who is doing that. And talk about ups and downs. There's lots of them. And there's both, there's both sides of the coin of being really frustrated and that they want things to happen so fast and like have a one-time event, and that being, now we're trauma informed. Now we can say it. And I'm like, no, it's a much more extended process. And then people leave and you have to train again and you have to keep going. And so I'm really enjoying that process with them and watching the ups and downs of that and seeing how excited they get about the implications of what we're talking about, and getting that kind of when the wheels start turning, like, oh, then we could do this, or oh, we could do that, and that's really enjoyable. So I'm really having a lot of fun doing that.
Very cool. So I'll take us, we went from golf to a very topic appropriate one, and I'll take us way off topic again. I about a couple weeks ago bought a massage chair. I've invested a little bit of money. You can spend around $10,000 on these things. I didn't spend nearly that amount, but I've always kind of wanted one of these. I sat in a couple good ones at one point along the line. It's one that does your legs, and man, it actually stretches you out. It does yoga stretching with you, and this was kind of my, hey, I'd made it through another business year and my taxes didn't bankrupt me. So it was just a little splurge of something I always wanted to get. And my wife, she, because I did something for her with the house, this was my reward. I haven't cashed in on it for a couple years. So, and she loves it too. So it's just really nice to like have a chair just to like crash in. And I'm trying to get up to that half marathon pace again. So I'm running like 8 miles, which I'm not really in shape to do. So I spent most of the rest of the day yesterday in the chair. I was watching NBA playoffs instead of golf, but it was nice just to sit back and let a chair take care of me. So it just it gives you like this warm hug, which is nice. So, because my wife doesn't want to give me warm hugs as I watch basketball. So the chair does. Good, bright, shiny objects this week. So last week we talked about some of the components and thinking about a little bit, and this is part of also the larger leadership trauma-informed workplace series that we're also doing. So we talked about some of the tangibles of integrating some of this in. And I want to get a little bit more specific with this and talk about maybe some steps when I think about helping an organization on their trauma-informed journey. And one of the things that I think is one of the first steps is the training step. I mean, if we're going to take trauma-informed just as it is written, one of the pieces of being informed is being knowledgeable about the impact of trauma. Obviously, it doesn't end there, but I think that's a big place. And I just, as we think about this, and Curt, your bright, shiny object, I think is really good for this as well, is I think a lot of people get a one-off training, maybe spend a day on just the research around trauma and think, okay, now we're trauma-informed. But when you think about if an agency would come to one of you two and say, hey, we want to take this journey, what are some of the components of training that you suggest people go through as that part of their journey? Obviously, it doesn't stop with training, but what training do you think is critical for people to consider as they're thinking about their own journey? Jerry, maybe let's start with you on this one.
One is to start with some clear definitions of what we're talking about when we're talking about trauma. And so people can have a shared mental model because really what I think the underlying issue is you're beginning throughout your organization to create a shared language, to be able to think about and integrate and organize the observations you're making of your clients and of the processes that are occurring between staff and administration to kind of organize some of that experience. So one would be to begin to start talking about it is to understand issues of prevalence. Some of the studies back in the 90s and have gone on really talks about how prevalent exposure to adversity is for people. And, over time, we've redefined some of that. So the early ACEs studies, but we've redefined some of that, thinking about, witnessing violence in your community, poverty, oppression due to racism or sexism, so really understanding a lot of what are the stressors that are on individuals. So looking at the prevalence, then getting into issues of development, understanding healthy development, understanding attachment, understanding neurodevelopment, understanding our autonomic nervous system and our stress response, and how all of that really leads to either healthy adaptation or in some ways having to adapt to invalidating environments, to kind of looking at some of those types of things. So really reframing a lot of the what we're seeing as people's ability to adapt to really what's happening in their lives, which drives the question not what's wrong with you, but what's happened to you. Kind of asking people to begin to look at it from a different perspective, And then when we're thinking about trauma informed, really looking about how that stress impacts the functioning of the organization. So looking at issues like parallel process, looking at issues, as we talked about the cost of emotional labor, and how even we get into either being open and curious about change and having to adapt, or in some ways having to defend ourselves and kind of cling to the present. So I think that looking at understanding that trauma, how it's impacting your clients, but how that interacting with your clients impacts you as a manager, as a case manager, as a therapist, as a counselor in these organizations, and then how your behavior impacts your supervisory relationship, which impacts versus down. So in organization, stress moves up and down within the organization. And really developing some strategies to counteract this pressure to move towards hyperarousal and defensiveness, and develop the interpersonal. So I think last week we talked about this sense of trust in teams, and having some clear strategies for implementing things. Is that all of those strategies we talked about last week help us to regulate, modulate our emotional experiences and integrate it with our thoughts to, in some ways, be more creative. So those are the things I think are important in outlining a curriculum for trauma-informed practices.
Great. Jerry gave us a great start. Curt, anything you would add to that?
Yeah, I mean, all of those content-wise, right on, right? You need all of those things to help develop that shared mental model and shared language. And I think, too, what I would add on to that is to help people understand the concept of data-driven decision-making. And I say that in two ways. One is to actually use like symptom tracking information and have good information gathering systems and use that to make decisions. But two, the shared language part that Jerry, you're talking about, that's also information, and it's information that we use to make decisions. And I think that creating that shared language and helping us to make decisions with agreement about an underlying set of assumptions that we make is really important for an organization. And I think that's a big part of what we get out of developing a shared language. It helps us to make decisions, hopefully better. And I think that's a really important part of a trauma-informed approach, is understanding how we as groups make decisions individually and collectively, and how we move from one point to another point with the decisions that we make is something that I think is a key part of that training. And that can be really important to verbalize explicitly, instead of just like thinking about, we don't often think about or make it verbalized how we make decisions as groups. And I think that's a really important component of really explicitly training people in what some of the utility is of all this information.
You know, just to kind of add to that, going back to your bright, shiny object, Curt, is thinking about it from a developmental perspective. So there's a difference between being trauma-informed, being trauma sensitive, so that you begin to use that information to, in some ways, be sensitive to your clients, to your coworkers, to the processes in the organization, and then lastly, becoming trauma responsive. So I think this concept of wanting to get a training and move to trauma responsiveness is very different than now you're just trauma informed. Right. So really kind of laying out that kind of steps and maybe as a team, as a kind of operationalize, what does that continuum look like for us?
Yeah. And you know, I started creating a curriculum back a couple workplaces ago, and I really thought about, you know, how do we help people sort of envision the journey? I think we all kind of agree it's not really a destination because research is coming out at such a rapid pace. You know, and one of the things one of the conclusions that I've kept now, it's probably been 10 years since I kind of created this little model, is really looking at the foundational pieces. And I think training is a big part of this as well as the self-care aspects. And really what we're talking about with this series, trauma-informed leadership and organizational culture. Because I still haven't found a good answer of how do you take this journey in an organization that's not healthy and functional in of itself. And so really, in many ways, when I created this online or created it with a group, this online continuum, I really started out with the leadership and self-care aspects of it. Is let's think about the self-care. Let's think about the health of our staff first, because in my experience, if the staff is experiencing vicarious secondary trauma, their own trauma, burnout, that there's not the capacity there to really approach the work of, like Jerry said, the trauma sensitive piece of that, really implementing that. And then I always like to think about trauma informed care build upon those two aspects of really looking at, okay, now that we're healthy, how do we look at really how we're doing things in the term of the trauma informed lens? And then the other piece I put on that, and I'll be honest, it hasn't been a huge part of my training curriculum that I've done in person, but I always integrate a little bit of it in too, is how do people position trauma-specific treatment? And we got all these best practices coming out. I think so often we're focused, okay, we're doing things in an untrauma-informed way as an organization. How do we move that? But I think part of this, and this is kind of my fourth level of thinking, so it's not usually something I have people focus on, because I think trauma treatment is born or is built upon the components of trauma-informed care. But how do we ensure that our folks have, whether it's trauma-informed yoga, EMDR, a trauma-informed CBT, how do our folks have access to some of these best practices coming out? So that's kind of that other component. I throw mindfulness in there, which can be more trauma-informed care, but thinking about that from that perspective as well. I think when you talk about trauma-sensitive care and trauma treatment, there's a whole bunch of overlap in between those two things. But I think it's really important to think about, okay, what's your capacity to deliver trauma treatment, whether that's within your school, clinic, organization, or whether that's with community referrals as well. And so I'd like to get your thoughts on that, because I think it's something we don't talk a lot about, because there's so much work to be done, I think, just to get our practices and policies in line with these principles. Just kind of your thinking and how you think about training folks or on some of these best practices that are emerging out there.
You know, Jerry, you always kind of tested me a little bit about evidence-based practices, right? Because they're hard to pull off. Mm-hmm. Like they become evidence-based because they're done in very kind of controlled settings with a lot more resources than we usually have in an applied setting. And so you're always kind of approximating them as best that you possibly can when you're actually in an applied setting. And I think they have some really, really useful guidance around just being kind of systematic and having names for what we do. I mean, I find it amazing how often we do things that are actual interventions, but we don't know that they're interventions. And once we look at an evidence-based practice and it has a name, then we're like, oh, now I know what I'm doing. I actually have a practice around that. But it's good behavior management, or it's good interactional strategies, and those usually have some kind of a name to them. Mm-hmm. So I think they're helpful for that. I think
in some ways, where we talk about trauma-informed as an ongoing journey, evidence-based practices, they have to say, hey, you're doing this evidence-based practice at some point, which brings, like you said, kind of that fidelity in there. And absolutely. Anybody who's ever, I know I just triggered a whole lot of people with that word if you've ever tried to implement one of these. But yeah, I mean, they need their road markers. They need their, okay, you're doing EMDR or trauma-informed CBT. So it is a much more concrete kind of journey in that way.
Right. I mean, it's one of the things that I really enjoy and appreciate, and also get frustrated with about my field of training of applied behavior analysis. Is one of the things that I say a lot that behavior analysts are really good at is we write stuff down. Yeah, we're really good at making things very, very step by step, which the purpose of that is to make them replicatable. Mm-hmm. And that's an important thing to be able to do. Like, I did this once and it worked, and I would like to be able to do that again. And we write that down. Mm-hmm. And we have all kinds of like evidence-based practices that we write down so that somebody else can pick it up and do it. And that can then increase the probability that it works or it's effective. So I think that's really useful. I also think you can trip over it a lot. And that, you know, that's kind of challenging.
Yeah.
So it's a balance, I think, that you kind of got to go through back and forth. I've definitely seen the experience of going through systematically teaching evidence-based practices, at least reading about what they are and what's the name of the intervention and what does the intervention look like in terms of moment-to-moment interactions between people. And that being something that can really help to regulate a group of interventionists or practitioners. Then it gives them some confidence in what they're doing and that at least they have an idea about that this is an intervention.
Yeah.
And I think that shift is an important one when we talk about professional therapeutic relationships, in that they need to be an intervention is a part of that. And our relationship with our client either increases or decreases the effectiveness of that intervention, but an intervention needs to be a part of it. And we need to be able to verbalize what the intervention is that we're doing. And I think that evidence-based practices can be really helpful for that.
Jerry, what are your thoughts?
You know, most of the evidence-based treatments have been built around DSM diagnoses. And what we know today is that diagnoses are very reliable ways of organizing information, but they're really not very valid. Is that when we look at the neuroscience under it, people have way more in common with people with different diagnoses sometimes than with people with the same diagnosis. And so I think our science is beginning to look at what are the issues, underlying mechanisms that are driving some of the problems that our clients bring to us. And then we can look back at these evidence-based treatments and say, what are the things in those that are best at addressing some of these issues? So things like issues like regulation, things like issues about attention, issues around anxiety, issues around being able to maintain a positive affect, relational kinds of issues that we kind of look at. So when we look at the underlying kinds of symptoms, if you want to kind of look at that, and then we have to be trained on what's the science telling us is the best strategies to address those issues, as opposed to pulling off a manualized treatment and saying this is going to take care of all my clients. So in some ways, it was nice to go from, say that, you know, you go back towards psychodynamic kinds of ways of thinking about it, the underlying neurotic stuff. We went to more of a scientific, but we got so locked into diagnoses that we have to really evolve from that. And I think using science to drive your interventions is a really important piece to kind of understand that, but it's a lot more complicated than picking a manual off a shelf and saying, now I can deal with my client around this.
Yeah.
Well,
let me pull.
Especially when we're talking about complex trauma, is that many of our clients come in with a lot of comorbidity. You know, they're struggling with depression. They're struggling with disorganized thinking. They have this dissociation. They're struggling with high levels of anxiety. On top of that, if they've developed strategies to try to manage some of this, so they have substance abuse issues on top of these things. They're struggling with real life kinds of issues because of their functional struggles with regulating emotions. So they have a hard time. So when we look at the clients we're actually dealing with, many of these kind of strict evidence-based models don't match up with who's walking into my office.
Well, that's kind of my thing about this as well, because I think some of my experience with the manualized treatments, I mean, it just was almost, I don't want to go in as a trainer and say, oh, now you need to go get $40,000 and send all your staff to LA to get, 80 hours of training and hire new supervisors. But I think that, at the very basic level, while that would be great if you had the resources to do that, I think just asking the question simply is, okay, if we identify a child or an adult with complex trauma, do we have mental health treatment options available for that individual? And that may not even mean that you do that in-house. I think, there's some benefit to that. But I think a lot of times people, I think, are so concerned with, okay, we need to stop doing the things that are re-traumatizing people. It's just part of my thinking is, okay, once we identify, how do we connect that person with treatment? And that may just mean that your referrals, so you update your referrals and ask questions to your mental health referrals is, what expertise do you have in treating trauma? Because while I think most mental health professionals have some expertise in that area, I think that also still varies pretty dramatically as well.
Sure. I'll give you an example. As I was treating an 8-year-old boy, and he ended up coming as referral for sexual abuse, right? But on top of his sexual abuse, he had a chronic history of anxiety, even prior to the sexual abuse, when you did the developmental history. And so really, I made a referral to a cognitive behavioral therapist who really focused on helping him manage his anxiety. And then I was able to kind of go back and help deal with some of the sexual abuse issues. Is that really trying to think about, trying to understand that just because the referral comes in for sexual abuse doesn't necessarily mean when we do the developmental history, looking at some of those. And really what I needed was, the mother was so anxious that I thought a cognitive behavioral therapist who could give a very concrete kind of prescriptive approach to the mother was going to help the child.
Yeah.
So in a way, it isn't that there isn't, these evidence-based treatments don't have things to offer us. But I think we have to have a clinical approach to understanding it, and then how do we use the effective treatments we have to best build a treatment plan that is most effective in dealing with that.
Yeah. Well, and I think, again, where I see this power really going, whether, again, we're talking about a school, a clinic, residential treatment facility, a shelter, whatever we're talking about, is that the environment that the student, patient, client is in is working to become trauma-informed, trauma-sensitive, and then treatment is kind of built onto that. Is that I think the more that we're all working to help heal the trauma, because in residential care, the therapist might have got folks for an hour or two, or maybe even 3 a week, but boy, they were spending most of their time with treatment staff in the dorm and in the school and those other places as well. So that's just kind of, I think, the real point that I've come to the conclusion is, how do we think about healing the trauma as, okay, each interaction they have, from maybe the front desk person all the way through their medical visit or school program, as well as that connection and bridge to trauma treatment when we identify that need is.
So I want to talk about an important component of what we're talking about, right? So you kind of led us down for a moment down this evidence-based therapeutic, the therapist working with the client, right? But I think what you're really talking about is when we're putting our clients interacting with individuals who aren't well trained, and haven't had the level of support, because oftentimes in shelters, oftentimes in treatment centers, oftentimes we're working with people who came with a really good intention, but they also have their own histories, right? And so in order to really provide really good care, whether you're in a residential treatment or whether you're in a shelter, is that the staff have to, in some ways, be able to hold their own experience, which means that they've got to be able to feel in a very healthy way what their emotional state is. They've got to be able to be present and responsive to the client, right? Instead of being in an anxiety place where they have to be defending against what's going on and what they're feeling, right? So how do we create a holding environment for the staff to be able to identify, tolerate, modulate, and express what they're feeling in a healthy way rather than being in a defensive state? Mm-hmm. Right? And so often the level of stress that the staff is put into doesn't allow them to be in this kind of responsive, what we talked about, trauma-informed, trauma-sensitive, trauma-responsive, is that they get this information, but then they're not in a place to be responsive in a trauma-informed way. They're more defensive. So I think the challenge we have in organizations is that how do we create this really healthy caregiving interactional process with the resources we have, mm-hmm. right? How do we empower our staff? How do we kind of be present enough to kind of hold their experience so that they can hold their experience? How can we, in some ways, validate and support, be both a secure base for our staff and a safe haven so that we're helping them explore their internal experience with their clients? These are challenging questions. And then how do we run a good business?
Yeah.
Right? So I think that these are not easy questions to answer.
Yeah. And Curt, I'd love to get your thoughts on that too. And I want to introduce kind of the one of the second steps I see after training, because I think these two come in together. And you talked about data driven, which I think absolutely agree with. And Jerry's talking about how do we run a healthy business as well, which I think is a data point that, hey, if you're being more effective with individuals you're treating or caring for with trauma, you should have better outcomes, and those outcomes should create a healthier business model. But I kind of wonder, when you speak about data-driven, Curt, I think one of the hard points a lot of people have, after the training or they're thinking with training is, how do I start to gather data on how well we're doing on our journey? And that's a tough question just to throw at you. But you bring up the data-driven point. How do you help people say, okay, how do we know this is having any impact? Because obviously talking about that up front makes it easier to measure going forward.
Yeah. Well, let me go back to the first, I think the part of what I had said about that, having an underlying set of assumptions, which would be the lens that we view symptoms through or problems through, as an understanding of neurobiology, attachment, development, all these things that are components of a trauma-informed approach, are really helpful in moment-to-moment discussions. And this is often what I found that it looks like. So I want to talk a little bit about that before I go to what assessment should you use and what kind of information should you gather, because I think this one is a really important one. So one of the ways that I think that our English language is actually structured is that the way that we talk about when we see something that somebody else does, we immediately describe it. Like Jerry did this, right? Jerry, Jerry was just coughing, right? So I say, Jerry was just coughing. And then the next thing I say is because. Right? We almost always talk that way. And that because is our hypothesis for why that was happening. And so thinking about that is a really important one, because we're in team meetings and when we're in discussions about either how our business operates or how our clients are functioning or how our staff are functioning, how we're functioning, we describe it that way. And we always, after we say that, we say because. You're talking about an employee problem. We say that, well, they did this or they didn't do this. And we say because. We might be right about that and we might not be. And having an underlying set of assumptions about how we understand that because is really important. So that's a fundamental change, I think, for teams and for organizations for how we generate the because. And that's a game changer for discussions. So I think that's a really important point that probably can't be overemphasized. And that's great. Like that is data-driven decision making when we think about how we generate that because. So go ahead, Jerry.
I was just going to say, and you know that I've talked a lot about this, is oftentimes you have contradictory becauses in a room. And we end up trying to convince the other person about the because. Right? And so what I've always said, let's put both of those becauses on the board.
Right.
As opposed to getting polarized by that. So I think that's a really important point you're making about how do you then manage becauses? Yeah, it's a really nice shift you start seeing in conversations when people will look at each other and go, that's an interesting perspective. Could I share what my because is? Right. And the more of those that you can get, the better solutions we tend to end up generating. So and that was something that I remember here, like, watching you do that. Let's put that up on the board, go on to the next one. And thinking about making clarifying questions versus evaluative questions. Those are important parts of this team dynamic, and they're a part of data-driven decision making. Right. And so this is where, when people are in feeling safe and there's a level of trust, then I am in a position of exploring so that we can explore those alternative becauses. When I'm anxious and defended, I'm really not open to holding multiple experiences. So that really other people's because becomes actually a threat to my because. Mm-hmm. And that's where I think creating what we talked about last week, those dynamics of the team, allows your team to feel safe enough to be open to the exploration of multiple interpretations of experiences, to kind of looking at that.
Right. Well, here's where I think I think you both just named my concern with a lot of people wanting to become trauma responsive, sensitive, informed, whatever language, is that, where's the level of burnout in your organization? I mean, some of the assessments I did when I created this curriculum, one was the professional quality of health survey. I wanted, if you wanted to say, hey, are we ready for this journey? I wanted to see your level of secondary trauma and burnout and compassion fatigue and satisfaction within your organization. Because honestly, if you're not a healthy staff, as I think Jerry kind of framed this, is if you're burned out, you're not going to have that cognitive flexibility to hold someone else's because. The other assessment I did, which probably doesn't make a whole lot of sense for people thinking about trauma necessarily, is the Gallup 12 questions that are probably the best researched survey out there, and one of the simplest for employee engagement. And I threw some other questions in there as well from different assessments, but it's like, where the starting process is I felt like I needed to help get an idea of where were you as an organization. And some people have satisfaction assessments out there already when you walk through the door, but it's like, boy, I mean, it just drives home what you just said. And Curt, what you just said is, hey, if we can't hold the becauses, again, where should our initial focus be? And it's probably not making large operational changes that you have no capacity to really do so. And I think we need to say that out loud to people, but it's really hard because I want to help people who are excited about this get to some tangible action so they can feel like they're accomplishing and resolving some of that cognitive dissonance, because I don't like to sit with people with cognitive dissonance either. But at the same time, I think those questions and that internal reflection has to be part of the journey, if not one of the first assessment points to get data on your own health and well-being. And people don't always like it when I say that.
Well, thinking about, like the whole parallel process thing, Jerry, you were mentioning, I think this is pretty interesting when you think about these becauses. I mean, the part of what our learning history does for us is it helps us generate that because. Right? We generate that because based on, in one way, from a neurobiological standpoint, the comparison that in our limbic system, the amygdala is basically comparing current information with past information all the time, and anything that is unfamiliar gets moved up the priority list, and things that are familiar with what we've experienced get moved down. Right? So we're always making those comparisons, and making those and comparing it to what we've gone through helps us to go, oh yeah, I inferred that correctly, or my because was correct, and that's how I generate my because. And so our clients who've experienced these adverse experiences and they had to learn how to cope with adverse experiences continue to use that because as they adjust to what's happening in their environment. And we do the same thing. It's not like we're different. Mm-hmm. And even if you haven't had this long history of chronic trauma and chronic abuse, and you don't have that in your learning history, you still have a history that generates your because. And we get those in conflict with one another all the time. So our brains are really like these anticipatory organs, and we infer intent on the part of others really quickly, and it's really useful. If you're accurate, great. That's really helpful. We're often really inaccurate. And so being able to be more flexible in our responding is really critical. And creating organizational structures where we get information to help us generate better inferences about the intent of others, or better inferences about the because of why things are happening, is just critical in terms of good data-driven decision making. And that data can be a lot of different points of information. It doesn't necessarily have to be a data point about an employee satisfaction survey, although those are good structures to create upward information flows. Those are really helpful in just getting us to organize information. Jerry, one of the things I've loved that you've said to me over the years is, I used to say a lot that the data don't lie. And you'd look at me and be like, yeah, but you can interpret them however you want to. So you can lie all you want. And I thought that was a great one. But at least you had information that helped you to start to understand it and ask questions.
Right. So I think your data question kind of looking at, right? You start from this information. And if you think about it on a continuum, on one side of that continuum is a reflection and a theory, right? I'm creating a hypothesis, but I don't confuse my hypothesis with reality. On the other side of the continuum is a projection. So now I project my theory onto the other person and I act as if that's the reality. And when you're dealing with trauma, you're much more likely to engage in a re-traumatization when you, in some ways, impose your view on that. So what we're talking about is, how do you move your staff and your organization towards this reflective process as opposed to this projective process, to kind of managing that, right? And on this end is trauma responsiveness. In this side is being trauma organized. And really that's the strategy. And so we know that you're really always, everything is data. So we're all data driven, so that you don't have a choice. You have to be data driven.
It's just, what data are you using?
It's what data are you using, right? And then how are you using it? So if we could be reflective and use mentalization, and then understand that we're creating a hypothesis about what might happen there, then we're much more likely to do social learning, to be able to use new information to adjust, adapt, and change. On this side is we're constantly projecting, to kind of looking at that. So I think that's a really good way to be thinking is, are we projecting the meaning we're making here, or are we making meaning and then doing in some ways an experiment to see if what we're thinking is actually true?
Right.
is valid. May
That's
not
a
be
good
true.
decision-making process.
Right. That's
Yeah.
your decision-making point.
Yeah. I mean, I love those kind of ideas of I mean, one way you're talking about is if you're using kind of, in your words, the projective approach, right? You're depending on usually one person's experience or one unit of experience.
Or group think.
Yeah, it can go that way really easily. And the other way, you get to benefit from multiple experiences. So you get to really kind of harness the power of the group if you can get a diverse set of becauses to start to get generated. Now you have the real benefit of social learning happening. Now, one of the things that we can do, it's such a benefit to us, is being able to hear from another person an idea and have that improve something that we have never experienced before. That's really efficient learning. And that's one of the reasons why I think us as a social creature we have such an advantage in dealing with our world, as we can depend on the experience of people with more experience than we have, or different experience than we have. And you can learn things really quickly that you would have no other opportunity of learning. And if we miss out on that opportunity, that's just kind of a shame.
Right. And so one side of this is I'm open, I'm flexible, I'm curious. The other side is I'm defended, I'm constricted. I need to be right because being wrong, it represents a potential threat and danger. Is that you see how your team kind of moves along these continuums.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I want to, because we're running kind of short on time, I'm kind of glad we got stuck so early on in this journey, because it gives me a good thing for us to continue to talk about the next episode. What role does assessments play early on in the process in your thinking? Because I think we all agree that the health of the organization, creating common mental models, common language, all that stuff, getting the training, the knowledge out there. But I think when people think about investing, and I always like to say, if you're working with me, the least expensive part of your change process is me. Because it's all the staff time involved in this and all that work that you're doing. What do you see? What role do trauma-informed, sensitive, responsive assessments that are floating out there at a greater and greater degree each and every year? If somebody wants to say, okay, how do I know this is working? Would you suggest they go the route of one of those assessments where they could reassess themselves along the way? Or would you suggest a different way to try to measure some success in this process?
Are you talking about from an organizational standpoint?
Or yes, organizational
client standpoint, like organizational assessment.
Yeah. How do you know you're being successful, and should there be assessment up front to measure that? I think that's my question, maybe a little reframed a little different.
You want to go first, Jerry? You want me to?
You can go first.
Because you look like you had some thoughts there.
I'm having some thoughts, but I'm trying to I'm trying to kind of think about where people are who are listening are on this continuum.
Yeah.
And how we could define what we're actually talking about assessment.
Yeah.
Well, I'll say what I think, and then you tell me what I didn't think of.
Okay.
That'd be perfect.
And then I'll say the question is.
The question really is. Like what you didn't think about, Curt. So here's what I think. I think assessment, no matter where you're doing it, right? And we're doing that all the time. As a process, we are assessing things all the time, whether you're using an organized, standardized tool or not. Right? That's information gathering. And one of the major purposes of that is to identify what is the problem. Like, what do I need to solve here? And so that's assessment. And then if you got ongoing, it is, did the solution that I created, is it having an impact, or is it having the impact that I intended?
Exactly. Yeah.
Right. So if you accomplish that, then great, that's assessment. Mm-hmm. Now there are lots of different kinds of, you can talk about what is the structure that we need in order to do that. And a lot of people spend a lot of time and money finding out from the assessment standpoint, is this assessment effective, and does it actually help people to create change? And that's an important thing to do too. But that basic process is information gathering to identify any potential problems or an intended impact that we want to have. And the other one is are the approaches that we're taking having the impact that we intended to have? So however you do that, I think is an improvement if you're not doing it at all.
Yeah.
But there are also some things out there that have been developed that can really speed that up and help you to ask. You don't have to think of all the questions, and you don't have to think of is this been used before? And so you don't have to recreate the wheel every single time. And I think some of the standardized tools that have been developed are really, really helpful for that. Yeah. You can also go really overkill with data. Right? The data requires, gathering it requires resources. Yeah. And you have to create some kind of a balance between the value of the information that we're gathering and the resource required to gather it. And you got to just balance that out. So that's some of my initial thoughts.
Well, and I kind of think about this on two levels. On one level, as you know, like I said, if a principal asked me, okay, why the heck would we do this trauma-sensitive school thing? If you haven't bought the Kool-Aid yet, it's like to raise your test scores. If you're a medical clinic, it's to have healthier patients. So in many ways, you want to improve your organizational outcomes. Curt, kind of what you're saying, what are we already measuring that's important to us? Because hopefully we're measuring what's important, which isn't always the case, but hopefully we are. And this journey should help improve those numbers. I think the hard thing with that, which is where I think what I like to call micro assessments, that, okay, how trauma informed are we becoming, or those trauma specific measures, is it's hard to say, okay, the training we had and this change effort created better lab results for our patients or increased our test scores, because there's so many variables involved in these things. So it's like, okay, do we just do the macro things where this process should improve your overall outcomes that you're already measuring, or should there be specific micro things where we're trying to nail road markers along the way to our trauma sensitive responsive journey? Any other thoughts, Jerry?
Yeah, I'm trying to think about how do you kind of meld this concept of doing these assessments, which really is looking at statistical information across groups, right? Not the people you're working with directly to kind of do it, right? So you need to kind of, and it's really helpful when you look at what are some of the trends that are coming up in either in the client I'm working with or in the team I'm working with, or the organization, that kind of match what some of the things are when you look across groups. But then you also have to bring that information and say, where is my group not kind of matching what this information is telling me, right? So we can do the same thing with data, I mean, with statistical assessment that we do individually. That assessment just gave me a because. I've got to then go and say, how does this because match up with the group I'm working with or the individual I'm working with, right? As opposed to just because oftentimes we do an assessment and then we take that because and that becomes our reality and we start interacting and doing, is that we've got to hold this because, and there's some validity because it looked at a larger group of people, but it's still a because. And I think that that's really an important thing for us to kind of how to best use these assessments, not impose that on my group and saying, because this is it, this is what you're doing.
Right.
Really, I now have a more kind of statistically significant because.
Yeah.
They're kind of looking at that. Does that make sense, Curt? To kind of.
It does. I mean, data, I think when they're used accurately, they very rarely give you answers, but they give you better questions.
Yeah.
And I think if teams can use it that way, I think it's really, really helpful. If it becomes, again, another thing that we can get polarized around, right? That's kind of problematic. So always asking a better question, I think, is a great kind of mantra to go with.
Right. Thinking I got a bequest.
Yeah.
Really good, statistically significant bequest.
Yeah.
Still a bequest.
Yeah. Yes.
I bolstered my because.
Well, and one of the things I just kind of want to throw out a practical thing, and I'll give this. I found this on the Wisconsin Department of Public Instruction website. They have some great stuff on trauma-informed schools there that they're doing in Wisconsin. But I kind of liked it, and I don't kind of throw it in too often to my trainings because unless you want to manage a whole bunch of qualitative feedback, it's kind of hard to crunch this in any time-effective way. But I think an organization that has gone through training, this process is called Stop, Start, Continue, and Change. And it basically just asks what current practices or approaches don't work, what should we stop, what aren't we doing that we need to be doing, what should we just continue doing as is, and what do we need to change or tweak of what we're doing. And that stop, start, continue, change, again, it's not going to give you quantitative data, but I think it could really give you a starting point. And that's where I think we're at it as we're talking about this transformational process that we'll continue next week is somewhere to start. Because I think a lot of people, and what I hope our listeners, I want to really not leave you here, is a lot of people get overwhelmed because, okay, we're doing this all wrong. Maybe our staff are now saying, well, we're acting like we're traumatized. You get all this. I think it stirs things up in a good way when you get a good trauma training, and looking for that initial point of focus is tough because, again, I think, and I try not to do this, I try to give some takeaways, but a lot of times for people that are brand new to this trauma stuff, it is kind of overwhelming. So again, that stop, start, continue, change might give you just some, okay, here's some points that we can work on. Here's 3 things we can work on in the next year. And I think we have to be realistic when we talk about transformational process, that if you're keeping the doors open, maybe making 1 or 2 big changes over a 12-month period needs to be realistic for you, and seeing this as kind of a longer journey as well. So I just found that I really liked it as a simple way to get a starting point to work at. And where I'd like to continue with our next episode is once you have that starting point, now kind of what do you do? Because I think just saying, okay, this is some things we need to stop doing or start doing doesn't mean you've solved the problem by any stretch of the imagination.
So Matt, I think one of the, instead of thinking about, are we getting traumatized, right, is that, are we getting stressed?
Yeah.
Right? And then in our stress, are we now developing strategies to manage our stress and cope with our stress as opposed to addressing our stress?
Yeah.
Right? It's the kind of looking at that, is that somehow I go into organizations and they're so overwhelmed that they've developed strategies to manage their overwhelmness, as opposed to building it. How do we become healthier and more connected and more open and curious and kind of do it, right? Which is what our clients did. They've had to adapt to living in these highly stressed, really demanding environments.
Yep.
And so I think that your self-care, what do we stop? When do we start? When do we change?
Mm-hmm.
It's a good model, but really asking ourselves, how have we adapted to living in this stress? And is this really something that is helpful for us in the long run?
Yeah.
Right? Because what we do then is train the next person who comes in to live in a really stressful environment, as opposed to helping them be healthy and using them to move towards health.
Yep, absolutely. I think that's a great place to wrap up today. I'm excited we didn't get through this whole thing. So the next time I want to talk about one of the bigger processes along this is, how do you start to review policies, procedures, practices, and approaches? Because I think that's a lot when we talk about stop, start, change. How do we start to reflectively, as we've talked about today, reflectively address these big potential changes that the trauma-informed lens might have us consider. So we'll get a little bit, I'm glad we got lost in the weeds, because I think getting lost in the weeds for a lot of people is really important. But sort of take a deeper dive into that piece as well. So we'll hit that next week. And as always, you can find resources, discussion questions, a whole bunch of other stuff at traumainformedlens.org. Jerry, Curt, always fun. And we will see everybody next week for episode 81. Thanks, guys.